you just having relationships with people who are different than you can make a huge difference to your growing up. And people don't seem to understand that thing. I mean, if you put people in groups, then groups start to sort of think, they're different, they have rights, they're this, that. So I think we have to be really careful, because I don't think that's working. Well, we've got clear evidence now that once you begin on puberty blockers, you go on, almost 90% of the people doing it go on to cross-sex hormones. And that's the scary thing, because, once you're in that, the medicalization has started and you're going to get surgery probably. And then you can't change very much of that. I guess more than anything, that's one of the things that has made me say, we have to learn to accept that people are gay or lesbian and just help them get there.
Welcome, Dr. Susan Bradley, to the podcast. Could you start by giving us a very brief introduction about your long and distinguished career?
Well, I started the gender clinic for children and adolescents in 1975 at the request of the adult service, as they felt that there was a need for these youngsters to perhaps be seen earlier. And I consulted the two social workers with whom I worked, and they thought it was ideal. I hadn't particularly wanted to do it, but I went along with it, and it became very interesting. And we've learned a lot since then.
This was in Toronto, am I correct?
In Toronto, yeah. At the what was then the Clark Institute of Psychiatry.
And are you an adolescent psychiatrist? Is that your title?
Yes, child and adolescent.
No, I have long been fascinated by the creation of the transgender child. And in the research that I've done, I came to the understanding that in the 1960s, Richard Green, Robert Stoller, and that gang of researchers, they turned their attention to feminine boys because all of the adult men were saying that they'd always been feminine. So they turned their attention to feminine boys because they were looking for the transsexual children, not so they could transition them, but so that they could prevent them from becoming transsexual adults. Because in the 1960s, that was not seen as a desirable outcome. And then you came along a decade later.
Mm-hmm.
Was that still the thinking at that time?
I believe so. It has taken a long time in our culture to begin to think of any kind of outcome that involves homosexuality as acceptable. I think that's changing, and certainly with this group of individuals, it's a good outcome in my view. But that's taken a long time. It really has.
Is it true, though, in the 1970s, 1960s certainly, but in the 1970s as well, that you didn't actually know at that point that these boys were destined to grow up to be gay? Richard Green's study was 20 years and it came out in the 1980s. So did you know that they were mostly future gay adults?
Well, we assume that just basically on what most people assumed of feminine boys. There's a fairly long history of that. And so it wasn't news. And we didn't know anything about what causes anything at that point, in my view. We certainly didn't know that there were vulnerabilities in certain kids that might make them more likely to follow that path, or issues in their families or things like that. We had one young woman come in after she had been assaulted. She was 12 or 13, and she decided that the only way she could be safe was to be a boy. And that's the kind of just too strong to say, you can't believe what she's saying. But most of them didn't come in with some clear sort of sense of why they felt that way. It wasn't clear to us.
That's a common pattern certainly now, the trauma response. The girls are identifying as boys if they've experienced some kind of trauma. But when you saw that girl come in, how did you handle her? Did you try and work through, or did you put her on a path to medicalization at that point?
No, no, all of the kids that we saw early on were seen in therapy, and, we didn't get into any sort of path of medicalization until really fairly long into the history of the clinic. I had been a bit concerned about even using puberty blockers, because I just had this background sense that maybe we were colluding with the sort of thoughts and feelings of these kids rather than offering them something. Everybody was concerned about their suicidality, and, naturally. What we were looking at was really what what can we do in terms of finding ways of helping them find a solution that didn't involve medical transition. That was all that we were thinking about at the beginning.
I would like to just jump in on a question there, just because you brought it up. To me, puberty blockers were a very radical, very life changing, extraordinary conceptual kind of intervention, like to block the puberty, to block. I'm surprised that you must have been working in this field, must have been 20, 25 years before puberty blockers came in. And so part of me just thinks, I'm surprised that you weren't astonished and thought, wait a second, this is extraordinary.
Well, you're right, but at this point, Ken Zucker had become very engaged with the Dutch clinic, and the Dutch clinic were using them before we did, certainly. And he had been, I guess, talked into that being a solution of sorts. We didn't have, I mean, we looked at the side effects and certainly the long term effects, and I wasn't comfortable until we consulted the endocrinologist, who sort of went along with it as an okay kind of thing, despite the fact that we knew that it could be irrevocable. And so this is where my concern that we were colluding just lay there as a discomfort rather than sort of leaping in and saying we shouldn't do this. And in actuality, we didn't do puberty blockers on any of our kids under age 14, 15. That was probably the youngest that we had even considered doing anything like that. And at that point, most of them, had been exposed to their own hormones. So I don't know what the puberty blockers really did for them, except we now know that they just sort of got on that path to cross-sex hormones, and that was obviously concerning.
And did other doctors in the clinic, like you had reservations? It sounds like Zucker was kind of talked into it by the Dutch clinic. It's very, very exhilarating to be part of a pioneering treatment that might, be a huge difference to people. What were the other doctors in the clinic? How are they? What was the general vibe towards puberty blockers?
There were no other psychiatric doctors in that clinic at that moment, at that point. We had two social workers, and Ken brought in a host of psychology interns, and they sort of went along with, whatever we were saying. And I went along with Ken because I felt, out of respect to the Dutch group that seemed to be ahead of us, we probably could try it. But in hindsight, I think I've really said that was just way beyond what we should have been doing. That would have stopped this whole thing, I think, if we'd sort of done that at that point.
This is something like I can't remember who calls them zombie facts, where it's misinformation but it refuses to die. And you were sold puberty blockers, told that they were reversible. That's what the Dutch told you, and you trusted them because they were the experts. And they have
And our endocrinologists did too. Yeah. Yeah. It wasn't just the Dutch, it was our endocrinologist. So that combination was enough for me to say, okay. And that's where we started, unfortunately.
Can you, for us, for our viewers, can you now slay the zombie? Can you lay that to rest? Are puberty blockers reversible?
I don't believe they are. And the more, there's two kinds of reversibility. One is the physical reversibility, and the other is the mental reversibility. The mental reversibility, it just doesn't happen. We know. Um, and we don't have enough experience with detransitioners to find how much the physical things have been damaged by taking these things. This is where I would love to hear from all the detransitioners that we could find about their experience after they'd gone through this, because it's beyond my knowledge of a follow-up. That's a group we just don't hear from. And I think that's important, especially around things like puberty blockers, which they were exposed to.
And for those who don't know, why are you saying that they are not mental? The mental effects are not reversible. Why aren't they?
Well, we've got clear evidence now that once you begin on puberty blockers, you go on, almost 90% of the people doing it go on to cross-sex hormones. And that's the scary thing because, once you're in that, the medicalization has started and you're going to get surgery probably. And then you can't change very much of that.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think so many progress?
This is where the whole trans activist phenomena took over. And we as a clinic could, work with people as best we could. But the culture was really starting to change. And what people could hear on the internet was starting to change. And it was really contagious, as I think, that, as I've said before, when these kids in their teens couldn't find acceptance for who they were in any real way, and they really desperately needed to be accepted. And so this gave them a solution, which, even though it changed their body, et cetera, it appeared to them to be a solution. And one of the things about kids on the autism spectrum, high functioning, is that they still are fairly rigid in their thinking. When they get hooked on something that they think is right, it can be very difficult to convince them otherwise. And this is what I think was going on, so that even though they hadn't really sort of gotten into it with all feet, they were being encouraged, if I can use that, to make a jump. I mean, the trans community on the internet was very powerful for most of these kids. It was acceptance. That's what it was.
This brings me to what my favorite of your stories, I think. I think this works perfectly. Can you tell us the lovely story of the young, he was a 16-year-old boy, I think, that you had been, or an adolescent boy who you'd been treating, and what his outcome was?
I didn't personally treat, we'll call him Frankie, but he came to the clinic when he was about 9 or 10. He'd had a long history of foster care, and when we saw him, he was convinced at that point, early on, that he wanted to be a girl. And Ken's team of psychology students would have worked with him or with anybody that was looking after him in the community to just keep him going and see how he's doing. And he happened to be connected with one of the agencies that I was consulting to, and I would see him every once in a while. The one day that I walked in, I came upon him coming out, and I said, "Frankie, you look great." I couldn't believe the transition in this kid. He was just so proper looking. And he looked at me and he said, "I'm not trans anymore. I'm gay." And he had been in this gay group for kids and run by two lesbian women who were really experienced social workers. But he'd met a young man in that group who fell in love with him, and they had a relationship. And that was all he seemed to need to feel I can let go of being trans. And it was really so convincing to me. I, I, I guess more than anything, that's one of the things that has made me say, we have to learn to accept that people are gay or lesbian and just help them get there. Because, even the ones who've gone through some of this and come out in our clinic, they're nearly all gay or lesbian. And
Yeah.
but as a society, we have not come to grips with that's an okay solution. The kids are probably more ready for that than their parents are. So
I often think gay rights was so successful, the legal victory, they got marriage equality, that we all kind of think, oh, there's no homophobia left in the world. And that's not true at all. And many of these kids can't accept themselves as being gay, and that's because trans is waiting there to pounce and they can get medicalized and they don't have to be gay anymore. It's very dangerous. But the reason I love this Frankie's story is that, it's the power of love. Like, just somebody loving you for who you are, and then you don't have to change your body, you don't have to pretend to be someone else. But do you think that's a part of why puberty blockers are also not reversible, in that the kids are not developing sexually, so they're not developing their sexual identities, so they're not having relationships and building intimacy because they're frozen in time?
well, there's certainly truth to that. And I think that uh, they they give the kids a sense that they've got a solution. That's what bothers me. It's a solution that I don't think is necessary, but it's their solution. And that's what I think we have to come to grips with. We have to learn how to support kids who are feeling this way, and help them become happy.
On that question, I think it's a really key question, and I don't think we know what to do. The fact is, the human generally, typically becomes sexual between the ages of 10 and 20, and adults don't know how to navigate that. Children don't, nobody knows how to navigate that. And so some people, go too fast. They hypersexualize them. They go too fast with them, which is icky for the children. Some suppress it out of fear, and some celebrate it, and it's over the top. And I just think, as a society, it's something I've been thinking for years. We're going to have to get to grips with the fact that, masturbation and all sorts of things are starting between those ages. And what is the adult meant to do? For example, LGBT or even gay and lesbian clubs. Should there be such a thing? Or is that running with the ball too fast? Like, should they just be like, listen, figure out your sexuality in your own bedroom and with your crushes, and frankly, keep the adults out of this conversation? Peer to peer has always been denigrated by professionals. And I actually think we should bring back a bit more respect for peer to peer passing of information, because adults, passing information about sex to children has become a mess. So, anyway, you've been decades in this, Susan. So I'm interested to know, how do you think we should handle this? Should we have these, gay lesbian clubs, or what should we do about this?
I'm a supporter of gay lesbian groups of some kind, partly because I realized after talking about Frankie just how powerful that had been, because there is not a community that kids can talk openly, and if you're in an LGBT group, you can talk openly, and you're accepted. And that is not, I think, normal amongst peer groups. That may be changing, but I think it is not accessible to a lot of kids. And so this, having some kind of group like that, for me, it became very therapeutic when I saw what it did for Frankie. So we couldn't have done it. Like we could have talked all we wanted, and that wasn't going to be the difference. He had to find somebody. So
May I say, though, I think perhaps LGB clubs, but once you throw in the T, and the T is so dangerous for any
yeah,
LGBT teen, because the T comes with this medicalization and this dangerous
yeah,
idea that you can't just be a lesbian, you have
yeah.
to have your breast cut off. So LGB clubs, I'm a full supporter, but you got to get rid of that T.
That's a dilemma, I think, because the people running these clubs feel that they've got to be inclusive of anybody, and I think it would be hard to say we can't have T in it. And the fact that some kids come in as T and go out as gay or lesbian is perfectly fine if that's a way to manage all of this.
To play a little bit of devil's advocate, I was quite pro gay lesbian clubs, and Malcolm Clark, he's a gay man, and he was a founder of the LGBT Alliance, and he kind of talked me out of them. He's
Oh.
gay, and he was saying, no, they should have clubs doing things like chess, or clean up the environment, or give them a project, because arguably we've created a society that can handle the fact that we've already created a gay friendly society. So your boy Frankie, in this context, maybe it was a homophobic environment, but now I know people rain on me and say it's completely homophobic and stuff, but arguably we should put the effort into the homosexually friendly, a gay friendly environment rather than gay clubs. There's something about, like, imagine a straight club going kind of flirt with each other. And there's something about it that makes you go, really?
Well, there is a parallel, though. There is a parallel, and if we look at what they're doing in the DEI movement and all of the separation of groups, labeling them as different, and you've got to have so many from this group, and if you're hiring, and so many from this group,
Yeah.
the results so far are not good. One of my best friends in medical school was from Africa, and we almost married, but didn't. And you just having relationships with people who are different than you can make a huge difference to your growing up. And people don't seem to understand that thing. I mean, if you put people in groups, then groups start to sort of think, they're different, they have rights, they're this, that. So I think we have to be really sorry or careful, because I don't think that's working. I think playing with, working with, really knowing, getting people like that, it makes a huge difference to your understanding.
Can we just stay on homosexuality for a tiny bit longer? Because I want to hear about I believe it's your first patient, and you have something
Oh,
of an
yeah.
update to share with us. Can you tell us about that?
Tell us the whole.
The whole story. Yeah.
Well, the whole story, my goodness. I started out because she, at that point, transitioned when she was 18, and she had to go through all the paperwork and everything else. And I did all of that, and sort of sent her to the adult clinic, but I had a role in sort of filling out all the stuff that was needed.
Was this about the late 1970s or so? Keep
Yeah,
going.
around that, yeah, early to late, yeah. I continued to see him whenever he called or emailed me. wherever I was working. So I went through my residency, and then I had a position at Sick Kids, and I would see him, and I knew this from the beginning, was in love with his best friend, a young woman who had had two kids from different partners. And he really was in love with this person, and she with him. They got together, and he looked after her kids. They lived together for probably about 40 years until she died recently. He was left trying to support his two kids, but the reason I got in touch with him quite recently was that I hadn't been hearing from him. And when I sent the message, he said, "I've had a heart attack." Um, and his job that he was doing is quite physical. And I had asked if his kids were going to help him before that, and hadn't heard back anything. But he got back, and he's had a heart attack. He's got a stent. He told me sort of how he was managing, and it's not simple or easy, and he hasn't got the supports he needs. But he obviously considers me a friend at this point, and I consider him a friend who was an ex-patient. It's been really an eye-opener for me to follow his path and see. I mean, he made a transition, I think, because he really he had enough homophobia that wouldn't be an acceptable path, and I think his wife the same. And this was the only way that they could live together. Uh, and he was a good husband to her, and she to him, a good wife. But he was really bereft. And after she died, he went and had a phalloplasty down in Texas, which cost him 20,000. And my first reaction was, "What? Why did you have to have a phalloplasty at this point?" But it was clear that it was part of that thing that I was saying earlier. He had to be more perfect as a male. His wife knew who he was and accepted him for what he was, and he didn't have to make too many changes physically. And he passed really well. So this was I was kind of taken aback when I heard what he'd had to do. But he's a nice guy. And
And
it's
at what
it's informative for me.
at what age was the phalloplasty?
He must be 70. Yeah, he's 10 years younger
Wow.
than I am. He must have been 70.
Wow. I've heard Stephen Levine say that there's an irony to this treatment because you're treating gender incongruence by creating incongruence in the body. So if like this person would have lived life as a man with a vagina and had a partner who accepted that, but when that partner died, suddenly the incongruence becomes much more front and center in the mind, and it drives an extreme surgery such as phalloplasty. Do you agree?
Yeah, that was, I think, where everything was at. And, even though I question it in my mind, it wasn't up for me. He was paying, an awful lot of money. But, but there was still that feeling that he wasn't.
There's more going on psychologically that I think is sometimes under addressed. So I'm thinking this person was effectively the father of these two children. Did these children ever know that their father was a woman?
I don't think they really knew, because he told me once about having to go to the ER, and his son went with him. And when the doctor came in and said he wanted to examine him, he asked his son to leave the room uh, because he had to explain to the doctor who he was. And so I think he passed perfectly well. He was just dad to the family.
However, there's an issue there because one day they could find out, when he's old and that he needs extra help. And that, but more than that, and that's not actually my main issue. My main issue is the block to intimacy. I think there's, if I found out my parent was actually a man or actually a woman, I would feel swindled. I think there's a psychological deception has arguably happened. I'm very sad for it, but I think it has to be acknowledged in all truth.
But the problem with some of this is that people often don't see other solutions to their situation or fully understand what those kids would feel about all of this. And so I think his solution was straightforward. You just can't hear this. And, he's looked after both of those kids. One of them died, but both of those kids and a grandson, and really raised the grandson. And they all, as far as they're concerned, he's their dad. So
one more thing, I'm not going to labor it, but surely we have learned, anybody who's worked in mental health has learned that the secrets family keep, you're only as sick as your secrets. The secrets you keep generally, they emerge. They emerge. Very few people really keep
they do.
And generally one person knows and the other person doesn't know. And it's like a novel. It becomes a big thing. So I wish this person as well as I can wish them. I really do, because internalized homophobia and the position that we're in. But I do think to look at it as an intervention and not say, "Oh, hang on a sec, there's all sorts of repercussions here." Unforeseen consequences of grandchildren and children and who knows what else.
Well, you're right. But on the other hand, I got to be practical about what I think this family could manage. And they're not a very sophisticated family. And I don't think that they have access to people to sort of say, I need some help, doing this. Like it's a fait accompli, and we've got to deal with it. And but I'm not suggesting that that's the solution to everybody's situation, but all of these patient stories are helpful to me in terms of understanding various parts of what goes on. And I was so taken aback when I heard he had to go and have a phalloplasty. I don't know what he told his kids about going down to Texas and doing something, because I'm sure they wanted to know why he went and had to, have this expensive surgery. But I didn't ask that.
And on that point brings me to something that we talked about before we hit record. And I think you said something like you had observed in your adult patients that they were just never happy. They wanted more surgeries. They needed a little something changed, or they got that surgery and then the dysphoria moves on to another part of the body. Is that typical, where there's no actual real resolution or satisfaction?
That wasn't my observation. That was I was going around trying to convince people to do things, and the person who accompanied me was Ray Blanchard from the adult clinic, and Ray and I were chatting about the adults, and it was he who said, from his perspective, they are not satisfied, and that's what seems to propel yet another surgery and another intervention. But I didn't see, other than following my patient, I didn't follow any other of the young kids I was seeing. I became chief of psychiatry at Sick Kids for 10 years, and that didn't enable me to do a lot of other things. Ken ran the clinic. I came as a consultant once a week. And so I wasn't as actively involved with the supervision or care of the patients that we were seeing. Ken did nearly all of that.
And it's that dissatisfaction, that ongoing constant dissatisfaction, that's actually what that's where the idea for blocking puberty came from, isn't it? The Dutch saw that their adults were not happy with their appearance, so they had the idea to intervene before puberty and therefore create this more pleasing appearance.
I think you're right about that. I don't know all of what drove it at their end, but it seemed to be something like that. That they can make it easier for them. So why not do it? Is sort of where it came from.
which was a real it was a real two roads diverged in a wood, really. Because at that point the interventions, the research was coming in that the interventions for the adults was not really working out very well. They continuously wanted further interventions. There was a level of dissatisfaction and a harkening back, if only
Yeah,
I had transitioned as a child.
Mm.
And actually in my own,
yeah.
I have an online detrans clinic, and I regularly meet detransitioners, and I'm meeting quite high numbers of them. It's very interesting.
Mhm.
And I have noticed that thought of, oh, if I had transitioned earlier, it would have been fine, but I didn't. And therefore I had to transition and
Yeah,
detransition and all this.
yeah,
It's very easy
yeah,
to go down that road psychologically. If I had become a lawyer, you know what I mean? If I had married him, if I had immigrated to America, it's one of those psychological little things we can give ourselves.
what if, what if?
So I
Yeah.
think there was a massive road in at that point with the doctors, and rather than saying this intervention is not working, they didn't apply a psychological lens to it. Instead, they applied a medical lens to
Yeah.
it. And that is where we brought in puberty
Yeah,
blockers and everything else. And I think we lost a lot.
yeah,
And can I jump
yeah.
in? Based on what you've just said and based on everything that we've just talked about, I know I'm hardline. I think that it's been wrong from the start. We never should have done it. Not a single kid should ever have been given puberty blockers. And I think the entire thing needs to be banned. But I'm curious where you stand on that.
Well, I would agree that theoretically and logically, we could do a better prevention of all of the things that have happened, and especially, and I'm interested in what you're saying about the detransitioners, because they can help us understand a lot. And But I do think that puberty blockers are not helping us. Initially with the adult clinic, all they had was cross-sex hormones and surgery. So it was really with the kids that all that started, unfortunately.
I have two rather large topics that I still want to cover. So is it all right if I take this, Stella?
Go ahead.
My first one is I've heard you say that the political social movement of trans activism or the trans community is like a cult and a
Yeah.
very dangerous one. Is that an accurate is that accurate to what you think? And if so,
Yes.
why?
Yes. Yes. Well, I think that they felt, I guess the word is disenfranchised, really from the beginning, and really knew that they had to shut down people who had any contrary views, and they pursued people. And I've told you about having Ken kicked out of the Clark, and all of these things we were all exposed to, knowing that at any point they could do these things, and it gave them a sense of protection and strength. But it also wasn't helpful for the kids who got caught up in that. That's the problem. There was no discussion allowed about whether trans were were something that was medical. I mean, there was all that stuff early on about it being, if you're trans, you must be trans, and you were born that way. That was and we know now that there's nothing to that. But they're still wanting to not get discarded, and I think that it's a dangerous thing for anybody in our society to be different. And so their reaction, from my perspective, is what often happens. Like, you try to make other people know you're okay, and not to make it difficult for you. But they've carried it too far. That's because they're going after young kids, and sort of on the internet. That's where it gets scary. If it were just the adults, that wouldn't bother me so much. But these young kids are very vulnerable, and that's just not good things to hear.
Could you tell our listeners, just so that some people won't know, about what happened to Ken Zucker he was a director of the gender clinic for decades. As you know, you were the chief psychiatrist of the hospital, and he was the director of the gender clinic. And then trans activists targeted him. And I remember clinicians telling me they worked in JIDS in London, and they said when the lead clinician in the world was fired, it silenced like you couldn't describe. It silenced everybody else under him because they got the big guy. So could you tell us, just to tell everybody who doesn't know, just a little bit about what happened to Zucker back then? It was 2015, 2016, I think it was. And what was the impact in the hospital? What was the impact of when it happened? I know you wouldn't have been working there, but I'm sure you would have been in the know.
They complained to his boss. They were managers. Some of them we didn't really respect all that much. One of them in particular was wanting to, I guess, make a name for herself, and said, we shouldn't be running this clinic. And they asked for an investigation into it, and the people who got consulted didn't know an awful lot about gender issues. And they wrote reports that were, as far as I was concerned, just useless. But they had, at this point, managed to get the attention of the head of psychiatry at Sick Kids. I'd gone at that point, who sort of supported them doing this. And so Ken didn't have any way of defending himself. Despite his presence in the world, it was because, he was doing something that they thought he shouldn't be doing. And that was the end of it. He has since told me that he's doing much better in private practice. So
And he got a
that made me
he
feel
got a huge
little
payout
better.
as well at the end. So he was vindicated, but it was a terrible, yet another line in the sand in this world.
Is it correct to say, would I be correct in saying that you're one of the world's leading experts on autism in adolescents? Is that correct?
I didn't start out with that, and I'll just tell you how it evolved. When I was trained in residency, autism of any kind was very unique. These kids had visible things that they did, spun, did all sorts of unusual things. And that was autism. And nobody seemed to understand that there was a group of people who were higher function, who had some of the same social understanding difficulties, some of the same rigidity, and primarily for me, the same difficulty managing their feelings. And when we started, I knew that these kids were not well functioning, but I didn't have a label. And I assigned the label of borderline personality disorder, not something you were supposed to use for children. But there was nothing else available. After I had been seeing kids for a long time, and most particularly after I left Sick Kids, I was doing consulting to children's mental health agencies all around the GTA, which is where I live. And I was working with well-trained social workers and psychologists who were trying to help these kids in therapy, and they were using CBT, some modifications of it that we would have used for the people who were having more difficulties, and they were all sending me these kids saying they don't seem to get it. They come to therapy, they seem to like to talk, but they don't seem to get what we're supposed to be doing. And when I interviewed these kids, I got this background history of all the difficulties with meltdowns and other things when they were young. and the difficulties that they experienced then in their peer group, where they always felt different and left out and all of that kind of stuff. And I gradually began to realize that there was this group of called high functioning kids who have these traits. And there have been some people who've really taken this up with a vengeance. Steve Porges is one who's very focused on the vagal nerve and the abnormalities in their vagal nerve function, the recovery function. And others have looked at different things. There's been a very interesting study now looking at brain function, specifically the connection of the frontal cortex with the path down to the amygdala and down there to the hypothalamus. And what began to appear is if there is a spectrum. When you look at people who have a psychotic illness, people who have severe depression, this comes all the way down to ADHD and ASD. And they all have the same brain abnormalities in different degrees, but also differences in cognitive abilities. So when you start with people who are only psychotic, they may have perfectly normal cognitive abilities, but they have the same problem managing their emotions. I had written a book saying that there are underlying factors that connect emotion regulation to every different thing. But I didn't have that information from the brain studies to know about this group who were in between. And, I started getting really interested in this. And I took a real interest in Leonardo da Vinci and Monet, and who took his ear off. Yeah, but so many of our great artists have these same difficulties. And some of them, they can overfocus because that's part of their strength. When they get interested in something, they can tell you everything you want to know about it. And those who could take that and use it really did wonderful things
Yeah.
in literature and other forms of art. And in the sciences, Marie Curie was identified as in that group.
Is that intense and focused interest aspect of the autistic mind, is that what makes them so susceptible to the trans ideology? They get an intense and focused interest on gender, on trans. Is that why they're so overrepresented?
It certainly helps. And this is why, I've made the comment before that once they think they found a solution, they won't let go of it. And that's part of the hyperfocus. This is my solution. Don't upset me. But, it's carried people to do great things. They're not all of the people I'm talking about are geniuses, but I just took this interest in geniuses, and the stories are all the same. But there are a whole bunch of high functioning kids who don't get picked up as in the autism spectrum, oftentimes even until they're adults. The vet who, whose name, these names are always leaving me, but a lot of adults who've begun to write now about their experience weren't diagnosed when they were younger. It was only recently that, this was something that they could understand. We have a lot to learn about supporting this group of people, particularly a lot of the girls. I've written a thing for women. A friend of mine who, before she died, asked if I would do something, and I did this commentary on the vulnerability of high functioning individuals. It's really sad because they can get into so much difficulty because of the intensity of how they go about things. But the background of feeling left out, feeling not accepted, wanting to have that is the same across the board. And it's really critical, and if we can find solutions for that, we're doing something.
And trans, they feel like they've found their tribe. That's another reason why they're so vulnerable. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Just to
Absolutely.
to continue on with that autism, I remember having a conversation with you some time ago, Susan. You mightn't remember it, but it always stuck in my mind about exactly what you're talking about. I see it more like a mindset, the autistic mindset, and don't shoot me, everybody. And their traits, the autistic traits that are, that collect together in certain people. And I often think elite sports is under recognized as definitely seems to attract the person who's going to, let's say, Nadal, the tennis player, you know what I mean? The relentless routine, the attention to detail, the extraordinary focus, the kind of, that kind of deadpan. They don't get
Absolutely.
excited, you know what I mean? And
Yeah.
then, there might be meltdowns in other aspects, but as well as that, Lionel Messi, the footballer, you can definitely see elite sports is an under acknowledged place where the autistic mindset thrives, arguably. So that they can, there's so much
I
for
think you're
that.
absolutely right. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very interesting and
But you almost
underexplored.
have to have a mindset like that in order to devote your whole
Yes,
energy. And I'm played tennis for years, and I'm always watching the tennis players, and their lives are not what I would want to have.
they're awful.
It's so
Yeah,
one
they're
focused.
awful.
They're
I was a
awful.
good swimmer,
Yeah,
and I
and so
realized what was involved to be an elite swimmer. It was like, oh my God, that's hellish. It's literally an awful life. But for some people, they would love it. It's like getting up at
yeah,
5 every morning, swim, 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 swim all day, every day. Like for some
yep,
people,
yeah,
that's where they want to live. That's how they want to live. It's very different. People talk a lot about yourself and Zucker, and I completely respect that you were kind of in a world not really known. You were at the forefront of something, and you were meeting these gender nonconforming kids, and what do we do? And you released that book in, let's say, 1995 around gender identity and what was going down. But people have often leveled at you that you were practicing conversion therapy. And I think the more I'm reading about it and the more,
oh,
that old one, I just thought we should really ask. And
yeah,
I think, I think society was very different. And so the presumption was, as you started this interview, the presumption was make this kid straight. That was what the kids were, the parents were bringing them to the
yeah,
clinics
yeah,
saying, sort
yeah,
out my kid then. That,
absolutely.
that was the option.
Yeah,
That was the kind of message. But on the other hand, as well, I think the presumption was, and they will have a better life if we can somehow lure them into being straight. Would you like to talk a little bit about that? Because I know it's something that comes up, just like what did you call it? Zombie information.
Zombie facts.
Zombie
well,
facts, yeah.
it is interesting because when they started throwing this label at us, we were really offended, because conversion therapy was really enforced kind of therapy that didn't allow for anybody to be ordinary or anything else, and none of us respected it in any way, and so we were often saying, we don't do conversion therapy. We're trying to help people understand themselves and make choices that are good for them. And from the longer term follow ups, knowing that more than 90% of our kids, our boys, were gay, we didn't sort of see that as anything that wasn't okay. So it was not in our minds, and certainly, I mean, we disliked that, and we really were offended by being labeled that way. But that's people throw labels around so liberally that anything that you do or say that's different than what they believe, you can get a label for it.
The idea was, as far as I remember from reading what you do, would be to try and make them comfortable in their own skin and to kind of integrate into a heteronormative way of being. You know what I mean? That was the grand plan. Is that right?
It really was to understand why they felt the way they felt, because except for the really gross one that uh, I cited about the girl who'd been sexually assaulted, who turned around. She'd had no earlier history of anything like that. But, we were always looking for the kinds of things that might have provoked it. There were frequent stories in the families of these kids that their mothers couldn't stand up to their fathers. And if they were having a fight, their mothers would never win. And for the girls, that was seeming to be a solution. You don't want to be a girl if that happens.
I frequently talk about this concept that a journalist, Megan McArdle, I think, came up with. It's the Oedipus trap. And it's where doctors who have been part of a medical scandal, they cannot face up to the harm that they've done. And so, like Oedipus, where he gouged out his own eyes rather than look upon the mistake that he'd made. The many doctors in the field of gender medicine right now, I think, are right there. They probably know on some level that this has gone horribly wrong and they've done terrible harm, but they can't look upon it. And I see you as being one of the rare doctors, one of the rare people involved in this who you've said that we got this wrong. You've admitted that this was we trusted the wrong people, we thought we were doing the right thing, and we got it wrong. How do you think we can help other doctors have the courage to do what you did and admit fault?
Well, I think it is a dilemma. And when I was trying to work my way through this earlier, all I could do was ask them to ask themselves, can you say, I'm not doing any harm? And that really, for me, if you think of the harms that you begin to see now, a lot of them could say, I didn't see it then, I do see it now. But, many of them really have held tight to what they believed they were doing, which was helping these kids that nobody else was prepared to help. But there's been so much data that there's no true trans, and all of that stuff is making it really obvious that we shouldn't be trying to create trans any more than the the individuals who cannot do without doing the trans we have to accept. But we don't want all of the kids who start out looking that way to believe that that's their only solution.
Wow. Thank
Thank
you so
you.
much.
That was wonderful. Thank you.